They said the Germans laughed. In a smoke-fogged briefing room on the far side of a different war, Luftwaffe veterans passed around intelligence sketches of a new American bomber, a machine with pressurized compartments, remote-controlled machine guns guided by an analog brain, range like a continent, and a name that sounded like a boast, the Superfortress. The pilots traced a finger along the artist's rendering, tapped at the long wings, and let a practiced grin spread. A flying hotel, one of them muttered. Too big, too complex. It wouldn't survive European skies, not with jets coming, not with flak battering the firmament. They laughed, and they were not alone. There is a kind of laughter that springs from bravado, from fatigue, from an instinct to wave away what you can't control. None of them would ever face the B-29 in combat. The cloudscapes of Europe and those of the Pacific belong to different histories. But the laughter traveled, by rumor, by habit, by the human impulse to reduce the unknown. Many in the Axis, and not a few at home in the United States, asked whether the Superfortress was a flying promise or a flying disaster. On the proof sheets in Wichita and Marietta, on the test flight logs, the answer trembled. In February 1943, a prototype lifted into a winter sky, its Wright R3350 engines burning hotter than their design temperament could bear. A column of smoke rose over the snow. The bomber returned toward the field and fell short, a fireball that consumed the neighborhood in its path. Test pilot Eddie Allen and his crew died at their posts. On the ground, civilians died in their kitchens. In the writing of war, there are names remembered with medals and names remembered with street corner memorials. The B-29's birth certificate had grief written across it in ash. Yet the idea would not let go. If the United States meant to crack open Japan's industrial heart, it needed an airplane that could cross the empty waters, climb above weather and interception, and deliver a weight of steel and fire unimagined at the war's start. The B-17 and B-24 had hammered Europe. In the Pacific, distance was a second enemy. The Superfortress was the answer expensive beyond belief, hungry for aluminum and genius and the patient courage of men and women on assembly lines and in classrooms, all of them trying to teach a new machine how to keep its promises. In a hangar at night, a young engineer walked under the B-29's high belly, ran a hand along the tunnel that would connect the forward and aft pressurized compartments, and tried not to think of the engine cooling issues that still kept the flight test team awake. In a barracks in India, a bombardier from Iowa looked at a map of China taped to the wall and learned a new phrase. The Hump, the cargo-gnawing ridge of mountains over which fuel and bombs would be ferried if the Superfortress was to reach the Japanese home islands from Chinese fields. In a kitchen in Tokyo, a mother, used to the whine of air raid sirens and the emptiness of her pantry, stood at a window and looked out at the wooden city sleeping in neat rows. The night air held the smell of ash from other fires, other raids. The Germans laughed in part because they had lived inside a different war's arithmetic. Their heavy bomber dream had stumbled and burned. Their sky swarmed with Allied fighters. For American planners, that world was data useful, sobering, but not decisive for a war fought across the Pacific. Between the laughter and the first B-29 mission to Japan lay jungles, founders' mistakes, invisible winds, and a pivot that would change the moral landscape of modern war. The B-29 was too large to hide, too complicated to rush, and still it was rushed, because war has a habit of measuring decisions, not by perfection, but by timing. It gathered in its polished skin the contradictions of its age, a pressurized cocoon with gun turrets slaved to a central computer, a bomber built for precision that would level neighborhoods, a technological marvel that killed as medieval fire had done by making cities burn. On the day the first Superfortresses flew combat over Japan, no German flew against them. The men who had laughed would learn of those raids by rumor and staff study, their war already narrowing toward ruin. But if you stood on a runway in India that morning and felt the hot breath of 4 engines turning, you could sense the shape of things to come. The B-29 was not designed to be laughed at. It was designed to reach across an ocean, find a city, and change history. The moral of this story does not fit inside a blueprint. It is written in the space between human bravado and human grief, in the gap between the engineer's solving and the survivor's memories. The B-29 would teach the world what modern distance meant, that there were no safe cities anymore, that technology had put vast choices into ordinary hands. Before it finished that lesson, it would light the night over Tokyo as bright as day. And far away, the laughter would stop. The Superfortress began as an answer to a question no one could dodge. How do you lift a war across the Pacific? In 1940, while Europe burned, the United States Army Air Corps issued a requirement that sounded audacious: an aircraft capable of carrying a substantial bomb load more than 5,000 miles, at altitudes where flak and fighters would struggle to reach, at speeds that narrowed the window to be intercepted. Boeing, already testing its B-17 Flying Fortress and drafting blueprints for a larger machine, answered with the Model 345. Where other companies offered incremental improvements, Boeing proposed a leap. Pressurization was at the heart of the design, a way to put a shirt-sleeved crew into the stratosphere and leave behind the oxygen, masks, and frostbitten fingers that had haunted B-17 crews. 2 pressure-sheltered cabins, forward and aft, were connected by a narrow tunnel arched over the twin bomb bays. The tail gunner would sit alone in his island of air, watching the receding world through a narrow blister. The air in those compartments would hum with radios and heated thoughts as the aircraft climbed to altitudes where the world was a pale map. Guns were everywhere, but they were handled in a new way. 4 turrets, 2 above. 2 below held pairs of .50 caliber machine guns, aimed not by men standing over them, but by gunners looking through sighting stations. Their inputs fed a General Electric central fire control system, an analog network of gyros and gears that computed lead and drift, assigning the right guns to the right target. It was the kind of engineering noir the 1940s loved, black boxes full of secrets, yet it worked, more often than not, in the trembling world of high-altitude turbulence. Power came from 4 Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each remarkable in theory and capricious in practice. They were 18-cylinder, twin-row radials packed tight behind a cowling designed to slice the air. They also ran hot to hot in the early days. The engines coughed, leaked, and if mishandled, or simply unlucky, caught fire. In a war that turned civilians into shadow prints on pavement, there is a temptation to treat mechanical failure as the lesser of tragedies. But men stood in those nacelles on test days, sleeves rolled, faces blackened, willing something bleeding edge to act like a factory product. The B-29 cost more than the Manhattan Project in total program dollars. It paid some of that price in the currency of fear. Factories rose to feed it. In Renton, Washington, and Wichita, Kansas. In Marietta, Georgia. In Omaha, Nebraska. Women at drilling stations spelled their names with the rivet counters signed in pencil under the aluminum skin. As the war moved, the production lines learned. There were B-29s and later B-29As with a strengthened wing center section and details solved. Crews learned as they went 11 men who would make a small city in the sky. Aircraft commander and pilot, navigator and bombardier, flight engineer, radio and radar operators, central fire control gunner, right and left gunners, and the tail. They trained in the American desert and at night schools that filled their heads with numbers, true airspeed, drift angle, fuel flow, and with images they would remember all their lives. Black water, tracer lines, orange blossoms of flak. But you could not win a war against Japan from Kansas. At first, you would try from India and China. Operation Matterhorn was the hinge of this plan. Ferry the bombers to forward bases in China from staging fields in eastern India. Supply them with everything they needed by flying over the Himalayas, the Hump, because Japanese armies held Burma and the sea lanes were hunted by submarines. Hump flying was a war of attrition against weather and mountains. C-46 and C-47 cargo planes went over with fuel and bombs on their bellies. Too many did not return. Those that made it delivered enough to run one B-29 mission for every dozen that were prepped, a ratio that twisted the stomach of any logistician. Yet in June 1944, the first B-29s took off from Chinese fields and aimed for the ironworks at Iwata, on Kyushu's first strike against the home islands since the Doolittle raid. Over Japan that summer, men looked up and saw a new shape. The superfortresses trailed contrails, like chalk lines at heights near 30,000 feet. The Japanese defense, hardened by 2 years of war and starved by it, scrambled to intercept. Fighters like the Ki-44 Tojo and Ki-61 Tony clawed at altitude. On some days they bit, on others they fell away, engines faltering. Flak followed the bombers up as far as it could, black scars in white air. On the ground, accuracy was not what the doctrine had promised. Winds at altitude pushed bombs off invisible curves. Clouds smothered the target. Weeks later, the Iwata complex was more bruised than crippled. Crews returned knotted with frustration, navigators angry at their drift tables and at the mysterious river flowing above Japan that destroyed their calculations. At night, exhausted pilots walked past this new airplane's ponds of leaking oil and sat under its wings. The B-29 was a marvel. It was also a nuisance. Its maintenance demands were prodigious. Mechanics bled knuckles and slept on canvas stretchers in the shade of nacelles, hands still sticky with hydraulic fluid. For each hour in the air, the airplane could demand hours on the ground. Some of the first units grew haunted by fires in the air that forced feathering props and prayers. Fires in the revetments that started as mere whiffs before a gust turned them malignant. It wasn't a joke to those men. It was a hard truth about a new technology loaded into history with a timetable that left little room for perfecting. Yet the B-29 could do something no other bomber could: carry a large bomb load from a distant base to the heart of an island empire at altitudes that only the best-trained, best-maintained defenders could reach. Even in its hurtful adolescence, it could reach over the map and touch Kyushu, Honshu, and the arsenals that fed Japan's armies. The psychological shock mattered. Japanese propaganda insisted the home islands were secure. Then the city sirens wailed, and the sound had a different pitch, higher, more insistent. Housewives felt for their bucket brigades. Men folded bucket lines into their nights. Children learned to recognize the difference between a single reconnaissance plane and a formation of heavies. German pilots would have recognized the emotions those sirens called up. They had seen their own cities leveled by an earlier generation of American and British bombers. But when they looked east through the fog of rumor, they saw a machine that did not fit their war's template. They laughed at the problem they didn't have to face. In China and India, in garrison towns that smelled of curry and hot metal, American crews felt the bitterness of an experiment run under fire. To measure success, one only had to watch the map expand outward. That would come with the Marianas. The Hump was never going to carry enough fuel to feed a fleet of superfortresses. The Japanese army wasn't going to let Chinese airfields stay unmolested. While B-29s sorted their adolescence, the U.S. Navy and Marines fought island by island toward a solution. Capture Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Build airfields. The runways on Tinian were carved out of coral in the war's will. When finished, Northfield boasted 4 parallel runways, each long enough to let a superfortress roll heavy and lift into Pacific blue. Saipan's Eiley Field and Guam's Northwest Field joined them, a triangle of concrete pointing at Tokyo. 21 Bomber Command arrived with its doctrine, folded like an instruction manual in a navigator's case. Daylight precision bombing, high and tight, with the Norden bomb sight twitching the airplane's nose at the last moment toward the factory roof. The commanders and crews who brought that doctrine had made their reputations over Europe. Brigadier General Haywood Hansell believed in precision not as a fantasy, but as a moral and practical strategy. Destroy the ability to make war by striking the engines of industry, aircraft plants, engine manufacturers, steelworks, ball-bearing factories. Spare civilians by not targeting them. The B-29 was engineered to live at 25,000 to 30,000 feet, where a cold sun painted the world below in a pale wash. That height protected and promised. It also, in the Pacific, lied. At that altitude, over Japan, there was a river in the sky that many American planners had not fully grasped. A high-altitude current of air, the jet stream that could roar at 100 to 150 miles per hour, and sometimes more. Japanese meteorologists had charted its existence before the war, their reports published in languages and journals that did not always travel west. Above Honshu, the bomb doors of a superfortress would open into this invisible river. Bombardiers looked through the Norden's glass and saw a gently drifting target. Then their sticks sailed away on curves that navigators could not correct because the wind was not a fixed thing, but a writhing snake. Precision numbers turned sour. Raids returned with tepid stories. Bombs on countryside, close misses, more effort than effect. It did not help that weather over Japan was a chronic adversary. Clouds that turned radar screens into noise, haze that made aiming guesswork, winds that drove formation, keeping into a kind of ballet danced by men sweating inside pressurized masks. The Japanese sent fighters up when they could, and after November 1944, when the first Marianas-based raids hit Tokyo, they could more often. The Ki-84 Hayat at the Frank, an Allied code, was a serious interceptor if its engine and fuel were good, and the J-2M Raiden, the Jack, could tear upward to meet a heavy bomber. The problem for the defenders was the deep one, the scarcity of high-quality fuel, of trained pilots, of reliable radar and coordination. Those problems grew worse every week. Still, B-29 crews were bleeding, in the sky and on the ground. Night raids by Japanese aircraft against the new airfields harassed the bombers where they slept. On a few terrible sessions, a line of superfortresses lit up in sympathetic fire, one burning giant igniting its neighbors. And there was fatigue, 12-hour missions and longer, night takeoffs with full loads over coral in columns of dust, temperature extremes that made the pressurized compartments a blessing and a hazard. Men took off with good engines, nursed the balky ones, and watched the sea with a fear that few admitted to in letters home. By late 1944, the intelligence photographs were not satisfying. The Nakajima aircraft plant at Musashino, near Tokyo, had been the target of repeated precision raids. The damage maps were speckled with hits and smudges, but the factory still worked. The war was measuring America in outcomes, not effort. In Washington and on Guam, patience thinned. Curtis LeMay arrived with a face like a granite step and ideas he was certain worked. He had run bomber groups over Europe and had made a brutal reputation by recalibrating expectations and tactics until the results satisfied him and history. Over the winter of 1944-45, he looked at the numbers, at the winds, at the photographs of factory roofs that refused to stop making engines, and made decisions that would define the B-29 and alter the cityscapes of Japan forever. First, he lowered the bombers. Night would be their new ally. The jet stream weakens down low. Incendiaries are more honest when aimed into chimneys than into clouds. Second, he stripped the airplanes. If the Japanese night defenses were as anemic as reconnaissance suggested, the extra weight of most of the defensive guns did not pay for itself. Remove all but the tail guns. Lighten the airplane. Pack it with napalm and magnesium. Third, he aimed not at the factory roofs, but at the city blocks around them. The homes that housed the workers, the small workshops that were, by the last year of the war, the dispersed nodes of an industrial effort deliberately decentralized to resist precisely aimed bombs. If you were going to defeat the miniature factory set up in a wooden home down a quiet street, you did not need a Norden. You needed fire. At 17 minutes past midnight on March 10, 1945, the first wave of superfortresses reached Tokyo at about 7,000 feet. Their bellies opened. Between then and dawn, 1,665 tons of incendiaries fell into a city made of wood and paper. The bombs were not simple sticks. They were clusters that burst apart in the air, showering hundreds of chemical charges that stuck to rooftops and lanes, hungry for oxygen. Crews saw their own bombs through the back windows as red streaks, then saw the fires join, wind-fed, building a heat that manufactured its own weather. The first crews who laid markers came in low and slipped out under a sky turning already orange. The later crews saw a living thing. A city writhed. Heat pulled air up in columns that tugged at wings, and down below, flames leapt street to street like decisions. The sound came up through the bay floor, a low roar, a constant. In Tokyo, people ran for canals and rivers, for stone buildings, for the black relief of an open patch of ground. Bucket brigades dissolved. Fire trucks stopped where their tires popped and their hoses melted under them. In the morning, the city would measure the night and call it by different names. Operation Meeting House in an American file. In Japanese memory, a night of wind and screams. Estimates would vary: 80,000 dead, 100,000, but all the numbers describe a single intolerable fact. A city died in a storm of fire, not seen since medieval invasions, but propelled now by chemistry and engines and planning meetings held in rooms with fluorescent lights. On the flight back to Tinian, crews wiped sweat that smelled of smoke from the insides of their oxygen masks. The tail gunners watched Tokyo recede. After Tokyo came a litany: Nagoya's weaving of flame, Osaka's burns along the docks, Kobe's flames carried inland by a March wind. The photographs came in heavy packets, and the maps grew dark in their centers. The legend reading, "Percentage destroyed." One of the facts of strategic bombing, written in a quietly typed report, was that cities made mostly of wood behave like fields waiting for harvest. Japan's war economy had chosen, under pressure, to scatter its factories into homes and small shops, to thread lathes and presses through neighborhoods, to put workers' hands on war materiel at kitchen tables. This was an attempt to outrun precision. It also made those neighborhoods military objectives in the eyes of planners who wanted the war ended. By spring 1945, B-29s flew in waves across the night. Stripped of most guns, they moved faster, slower targets on radar, but louder on the ground. Japanese night fighters found them where they could. The J-1N1 Gecko Irving in Allied code carried a radar set when there was a radar set to carry, and sometimes that was enough. There were upward-firing cannon that had taken a toll on British bombers over Germany. There were ad hoc tactics born of desperation. Ramming, Tai-Atari, where a pilot steered his fighter deliberately into the tail of a B-29, living if luck and an open canopy gave him time to jump. The finest of the Japanese fighters, the Ki-84, the N-1K Shidenkai, could be lethal in a climb if fuel of the proper octane reached them, if pilots had more than a handful of hours in the cockpit, if maintenance crews had not been reduced to cannibalizing parts. The airfields in the Marianas became cities. Tinian's North Field, squared and gridded with taxiways, named as Manhattan avenues and streets, held the regular rhythms of war: briefings, mess halls, dice games, a mail call that could lift a man by inches off the ground, mosquitoes and dust, a Pacific heat that sank into the aluminum skin of airplanes after sunrise, the smell of hot breaks at noon. The men who lived in those patterns grew thinner, quiet in a specific way. They wrote in their diaries about the strange beauty of a city from 8,000 feet, the grid of streets laid out like a lesson, a fire waking in corners and running out of straight lines. They also wrote about the engine that had kept misfiring for 3 missions now, and the crew chief's promise to chase that gremlin down, about the navigator who had lost his place under heavy winds and who drank quietly and then stopped drinking. They carried talismans and listened to the radio crackle with rumors of leave, of promotion, of home. On Okinawa, in April 1945, a different war churned the sea into gray froth. But its reach touched the B-29s. On the night of May 24th to 25th, 1945, a hand-picked group of Japanese commandos, the Geretsu Kutetai, flew in transport planes toward the airfields on Okinawa. They landed in the dark on Yanton, blowing up fuel dumps and airplanes, trying to make a dent large enough to matter. On Tinian and Saipan, Japanese Navy and Army planes made night raids that set superfortresses alight on their hardstands, the crews scrambling in bare feet, throwing sand and shouting. It is in those moments that a machine loses its abstraction. The war becomes a wall of flame at the edge of your bed. There was also a quieter campaign, technical and devastating. Operation Starvation, the aerial mining of Japan's home waters. B-29s flew low and laid mines across shipping lanes, harbor mouths and straits, a net of metal and calculation that trapped merchant ships and starved the island nation of food and fuel. In a way, this was the most efficient use of the Superfortress risk-adjusted tonnage for effect. The mining operations sank or damaged more tonnage than many high-profile raids, and did it with a cold math that appealed to staff officers who measured war without smoke in their eyes. But photographs of cities burned were what the public saw, and what the crews could not unsee. It is one thing to choke a nation's logistics. It is another to watch a neighborhood you can imagine living in burn to its foundations. The Japanese defense adapted when it could. Searchlights and radar found shapes. Fighters were cued, but the night was long, and the B-29s came from far across the sea in numbers that grew. Anti-aircraft gunners learned to aim at shadows and sound. There were counters and counters. The Americans adjusted altitudes to slip between layers of flak and wind. The Japanese shifted guns when the B-29s came at dusk rather than midnight. By summer, fuel was too dear for some fighters even to taxi. The air war in the home islands had a scrambling, short-of-everything quality that mocked bravery and made improvisation a way of life. Back home, the engineers kept solving. Production lines flowed more smoothly. Later engines behaved better under sustained load and heat. Some B-29s were built as B-29Bs, stripped of most turrets to save weight and designed for radar-directed night operations. Radar operators grew more skilled with their glowing green screens, guiding their bombs by shoreline shapes and river signatures when clouds hid the city. On the ground, mechanics took tricks learned at 3 a.m. and turned them into standard practice. When a B-29 taxied out, heavy and committed, it did so on the faith of the hands that had leaned into its skin for hours. By August 1945, maps at 21 Bomber Command told a blunt story. 60 and more cities damaged so severely their silhouettes bent in memory. The figure on some staff officer's chalkboard, written hard enough to squeak, read like a ledger. It did not capture other things. The woman who had run with her child to a canal and lived to see a new Tokyo built. The crewman who discovered he did not have dreams anymore, just a roiling heat at the edge of his sleep. It did not capture the scolded pride between crew and crew, the ones who flew high in daylight with their noses tilted like the doctrine taught, and the ones who dove low into the orange night and came out with their eyebrows singed, sharing cigarettes. It did not capture how 2 forms of war met, and for a season became one. There was always another mission on the board. It might be a daylight attack with high The end of this story begins in a workshop on Tinian that did not exist on any map of the base. Inside, carpenters, machinists, and airplanes solved a new problem: how to carry bombs unlike any yet lifted long and heavy, full of a physics that most of the men around them did not fully understand. The word for these aircraft was silverplate, and their B-29s were special, lightened of guns, their bomb bays modified. Between wiring harnesses and pencil marks, the war's geometry bent again. On August 6, 1945, one of those modified B-29s lifted into the morning. Its crew, led by a colonel who had trained for this day with the focus of somebody who knows he is stepping into history, flew northwest. In the belly was a single bomb with a name too easy for what it meant. The target city woke to a day that would be recorded in new terms: hypocenter, kiloton, radiation sickness. The flash erased shadows into perfect silhouettes before men and women and children took a breath that would be their last. 3 days later, another B-29, another crew, another city. There is a way to tell this part of the story only in terms of strategy: to list the tonnage burned in the months prior, to point to the stubbornness of a cabinet debate inside Tokyo, to show that it took the weight of 2 new suns and the Soviet entry into the war to break that logic. But to tell it only that way is to step aside from a truth every person watching the rising fire understood: something irreversible had happened. B-29 crews who had flown over Tokyo's flames watched the world's mood shift with them. Some felt relief that no more missions into the orange glowing nights would be asked of them. If this did what it promised, they would go home. Some felt a raw wrongness they could not name, but would later try to explain to spouses over kitchen tables in California and Ohio. The crews who flew those 2 missions sat in debriefings and drank coffee and listened to the key word, effective, and understood that it was not a word big enough for what they had done. In Tokyo, in Hiroshima, in Nagasaki, the survivors learned new names for old fears and lived with a future that had to hold 2 truths at once: that their nation had waged a brutal war, and that they had been made examples in a lesson that exceeded their individual guilt. In American living rooms, newspapers unfurled photographs and headlines. The end of the war arrived in the radio's warm glow. On August 15th, the Emperor spoke, and the voice that no one had heard before on the air told the nation it must endure the unendurable. In the Marianas, men stood and shouted and cried and lay down right where they were to sleep. German pilots, the ones whose laughter had been part of our story's hook read about it, all in papers printed on rough wartime stock, or heard it in Soviet camps and American hospitals. Whatever jokes they had told about, American hubris and shiny over-engineering had been burned away in the proof of a machine they had never met. The Superfortress's war was not theirs, but the future's war would be shaped by it. In the years that followed, the B-29's legacy took on unexpected shapes. 3 superfortresses that had diverted to Soviet territory during earlier raids were reverse-engineered with a thoroughness that bordered on devotion, becoming the Tu-4, Russian twin in metal and rivet that would carry nuclear weapons under a different flag. On American bases, B-29s served on in Korea, where their daylight precision dreams flickered and died under communist flak and MiG attacks, and where they learned to survive as night raiders again. Bombers that had been cutting edge in 1945 were now old men under a new sun, but they still flew, engines coughing in winter cold, the past rattling around their cockpits as they set off on another mission. Their children B-50s, B-36s, and swept-wing jets learned from their systems and their scars. The technology was a triumph. The ethics were a bruise that would not fade. The B-29 carried both. It was, at its heart, a machine that took orders without argument and did not sleep. It allowed men to reach over an ocean and touch a city, then another, then another. It measured American power in aluminum and octane and training hours. It tested American ideas about precision and sparing and the acceptable radius of war. It found the jet stream and could not at first conquer it, then learned to step around it. It faced lightly manned defenses and still sometimes died there, metal and men falling into the cold Pacific. It made airfields grow from coral atolls into metropolises of war. It left behind a string of ghostly air pictures that looked like logic made visible. But the core of this story is human. A riveter running her fingers along the neat line of her work, wondering if the boys will notice. A Japanese mother who, decades later, can still smell burned tatami when it rains. A navigator who grew old and never stopped making tiny corrections as he drove on the highway, eyes flicking from mile marker to mile marker. A German pilot who had boasted in a too loud voice about American toys, then found himself under the rubble of his own city and decided never to laugh about engineering again. A mechanic who knew the habit of one particular engine, the cough before the cough, and who slept like a stone once he found the loose line. It is tempting to say the Superfortress ended the war. It is more honest to say it helped make a set of choices unavoidable. Japan's cities were leveled not by a single airplane, but by a coalition of grim arithmetic, firebombing, mining, blockade, political fissures, and 2 atomic detonations that made even hard men in dark rooms sit very still. The B-29 was the delivery system for much of that. Its crews bore the weight of the decisions it enabled and were praised for their bravery and sometimes burdened by it. What remains for us now, watching the grainy footage and the smooth panning shots over ruins reconstructed, is not to judge with the easy self-confidence of distance, but to learn. We can learn from the arrogance that underestimates a thing because it is new, from the laughter that gives comfort at the cost of recognition. We can learn how a technology meant to be precise can tilt, under pressure, into broad destruction, and how moral arguments within uniforms can be as fierce as those between enemies. We can acknowledge the skill and courage of the people who made the B-29 fly and the suffering of those whose lives it set on fire. The story that began with laughter in a room full of smoke ends with silence over rebuilt streets. The B-29, ungainly and graceful, miraculous and ordinary, taught the world that distance no longer meant safety. It asked questions that every generation since has had to answer anew. As we look back at its shadow on a Pacific